And now we're going to move on to conduct of business, please.
Item 6A, adopt resolution accepting the Green Infrastructure Plan.
Director Tan.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. Before we begin with the presentation, I'd like to provide a brief background on this item. See here, this item was brought to you starting in 2017 when staff came for an approval of the framework of work plan for developing the Green Infrastructure Plan. And subsequently, staff also issued an RFP in September of 2018 to seek services of a firm to develop this plan for the city. And this plan is mandated by the regional board as part of the municipal regional permit and needs to be submitted as part of the annual report next month. So after review of the proposals that we received from the consultant, staff came back to council in December 2018 to recommend awarding the contract to Lotus Water, which is a firm that demonstrated the strong understanding of the project and the development of this plan. And this GI plan is very detailed, as it includes information such as recommendations to update the city's planning documents, design guidelines, standards, methodologies to prioritize the GI projects, work plan for prioritized projects, and funding options. So being that the city receives minimal stormwater funding through parcel tax, it's not enough to implement some of the recommended projects. Therefore, funding for the recommended projects are unidentified at this time. So Scott Durbin is here from Lotus Water to provide a summary of the GI plan, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have after the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy.
Please.
Thank you. So as Jimmy said, I'm going to go through the newly developed Green Infrastructure Plan for the city of San Bruno with the goal at the end of hopefully to achieve the adoption of this plan at the end of the session. So this is the content that I'll be covering today. We'll start discussing some of the stormwater challenges in urban areas, what's driving the need for the Green Infrastructure Plan, and then discuss a little background on green infrastructure, what it is, what are the benefits of it, and then go through the regulatory mandates, what's requiring that this GI plan be developed for all the cities across the Bay, and then go through the key elements of the plan and talk plan adoption and next steps. So first, stormwater challenges. Stormwater management in urban areas creates a number of challenges. Principal of those are pollutant loading to receiving waters and flooding, which can cause ecology and human health impacts. So because of that, it's mandating stormwater management requirements for cities. Two of the most critical pollutants in the Bay Area that the Regional Water Quality Control Board is limiting are mercury and PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. The GI plan is part of the requirement to develop a strategy to help reduce the loading of these pollutants into the Bay. So what is green infrastructure? Green infrastructure uses soils and plants and other technologies like permeable surfaces to reduce, slow down, and clean stormwater runoff before it goes into our creeks and into the Bay or the ocean. So some examples of green infrastructure include bioretention, also called rain gardens. So these are engineered soil with plants that filter the runoff and treat it. Pervious pavement, like the example shown here, where there's pervious areas within the pavement, allow the runoff to go through the soil and be treated. Green roofs, which are similar to bioretention, but smaller soil media on roofs. And rainwater harvesting systems, which capture and reuse stormwater for non-potable uses like irrigation or toilet flushing. So the main purpose of green infrastructure is to help restore natural watershed function. So before development, over half of the water that fell on the surface was infiltrated and treated and drained back to our creeks and streams. And then after development, a lot of that area has been paved over. Now 5 to 10% of that runoff gets into the soil, gets treated, goes back. It also picks up more pollutants over these paved areas, and it increases the rate of flow going through these storm drains, which can cause erosion and also flooding issues, which are potentially will be exacerbated by climate change impacts with changes to rainfall patterns. So the goal of green infrastructure is to help introduce more pervious spaces back within the urban environment, slow down, capture, and treat that runoff, to help restore some of the natural watershed function. So just recapping quickly the benefits of green infrastructure: reducing pollution, increasing natural habitat, helping to manage some flood risk, creating greener, safer streets, so incorporating green infrastructure into bulb outs or into traffic calming elements within the streetscape, helping with urban heat island effect, and recharging groundwater, local water supplies, or reusing it, as I mentioned earlier. So why does San Bruno need a green infrastructure plan? Jimmy touched on this, that it's required as part of the city's stormwater permit. There's PCB and mercury load reduction goals by 2040. So the permit requires that San Bruno and all the cities around the Bay develop a GI plan to show to help facilitate green infrastructure implementation and make progress towards these reductions by 2040. The GI plan needs to be submitted along with the stormwater annual report to the regional board in September. And there's potential consequences for not complying with the permit, including fines and other lawsuits under the Clean Water Act. So the benefits of the GI plan: one, it creates a roadmap for an integrated gray and green system. So the city stormwater system is largely gray right now. It's pipes and catch basins to collect and convey the runoff. So this is a roadmap to how to integrate green infrastructure elements into that to treat, slow down, and filter runoff. It facilitates systematic integration of green infrastructure into the existing city planning practices and project delivery methods, and it helps identify priority locations for green infrastructure and more cost-effective projects. It is consistent with the other plans that the city has out there in terms of creating sustainable communities. So the GI plan is a pretty substantial, comprehensive document. There's a number of elements in it. These listed here are the ones I'm going to go through in the next slides, from evaluation of how it's integrating with existing city plans, to developing green infrastructure design guidance and details, identifying and prioritizing opportunities, a reasonable assurance analysis, which is a modeling analysis to look at benefits and performance of these projects, looking at funding, and then also developing a web-based user interface to track performance of implemented GI to see progress towards these targets. So starting with that first element, the integration with the city plans. So the consultant team, we looked at all the city plans and evaluated the language within it, and by and large, they all had good language referencing green infrastructure and aligning, and so they aligned with the objectives of the plan. For example, the general plan had several statements such as require and or promote green infrastructure on public and private land. Similarly, transit corridors plan had language such as explore opportunities for sustainable infrastructure and green streets. So we suggested recommended language, but also developed a work plan of what plans should get updated to include more GI language, and that's only the walk and bike plan in 2020 was the only recommendation for additional GI language. Also, as part of this, we developed, along with the CCAG, the Stormwater Agency for the countywide, developed a GI design guideline, which includes information on 13 different GI technologies. It's kind of a guide for designers on where and how to implement green infrastructure. It includes operations and maintenance considerations. And it also had the first draft of green infrastructure details, which are actually based on City of San Francisco's green infrastructure details. So what we did as part of the GI plan was make them more compatible to San Bruno, evaluate all those details, look at the city's standard street details, and make sure that they are compatible with GI, and make recommendations for utility setbacks and standards. So help develop and facilitate implementation of construction documents. The next big component of this was identifying project opportunities. As part of that, we grouped all projects into three main project types, these three here: regional projects, Green Street, and parcel projects. The regional projects are the really large-scale projects. They capture runoff directly from a storm drain. They treat hundreds of acres potentially upstream, both from parcels and streets. The next type is green streets, which are block-scale projects, just street runoff from the street itself, usually with fire retention or permeable pavement. And the last type, parcel projects, which could be private redevelopment projects, but also public projects on city parcels to manage their own runoff on site, retrofitting those parcels to manage runoff on site. So we went through a large prioritization process. It built off a countywide effort that was already conducted with the help of the city of San Bruno. and grouped all these projects into high, medium, low for regional, Green Street, and the public city parcel project opportunities. So this prioritization included both stormwater performance, but also site characteristics. So it looked at flooding, groundwater recharge, and water quality improvements, but also slope, soils, space constraints, and co-benefits such as providing benefits to disadvantaged communities or areas that need more greening. It was all incorporated into a prioritization process to arrive at these results. And then those prioritization projects were put into a modeling analysis called a reasonable assurance analysis, also required by the city permit, stormwater permit. So this reasonable assurance analysis evaluates the amount of green infrastructure needed to achieve the 2040 target. So hundreds of different project mixes were modeled, and the project types were the three I mentioned: the regional, Green Streets, and parcel projects. But we also looked at projection of future new and redevelopment. Where is redevelopment happening, and how much could green infrastructure manage on those parcels? So putting those all together, we looked at 100 different scenarios, arrived at the lowest cost option, which is approximately 200 acres managed by green infrastructure to reach that 2040 target. This is an example of the breakdown of those different project types that resulted from that analysis, where you have 5% being met by existing projects, so the city's Green Street that's already implemented, and other green infrastructure on private redevelopment projects, and then another about quarter by future new and redevelopment, such as like Bay Hill and other big redevelopments that are projected to achieve these pollutant reductions. And then the biggest component of this was a regional project that was identified as part of this process that will undergo further feasibility evaluation, which I'll talk about in the next slide. That's doing the bulk of the work here, and regional projects generally are much more cost effective than Green Streets or parcel-based projects, largely because of the economies of scale of those projects. And the remainder was done by these high priority Green Streets, so didn't need to get to medium or low priority Green Streets or even parcel retrofits necessary for this lowest cost scenario. So a little bit more about that regional project that was identified. It's located between 280 and 380 on Caltrans property. It would manage not only City of San Bruno runoff, but it's Caltrans and the unincorporated county area. So the split of that cost, if it moved forward, is still to be determined. The only regional project that's currently in design for the county that's coming out of this process to meet mercury and PCB reduction goals is in South San Francisco, and Caltrans is paying for that project. So Caltrans is putting money forward to meet their own requirements as part of this. And the city did receive a grant to further evaluate the feasibility. So the city, along with the County Office of Sustainability, submitted a grant and were awarded a grant to further evaluate feasibility of this project. In addition to that regional project, what the next steps are taking this large pool of prioritized projects into a smaller subset, evaluating the feasibility and funding options for those, in particular looking at some of the near-term planned projects, such as San Mateo Avenue Streetscape Project, identifying opportunities to integrate green infrastructure into those projects, piggybacking off some of the countywide work that's happening that we're also a part of, which includes the Sustainable Streets Master Plan, which is evaluating green streets and identifying green streets opportunities in more detail. So the next big component, or the next component of the GI plan, was a funding evaluation. So listed there on the left, the current sources for stormwater funding, the parcel tax. This fourth one here, the EPA grant, is the one I mentioned that the city was awarded. The CCAG was also awarded a $3 million state budget earmark to further evaluate regional projects. So the split of that $3 million is also not decided yet, but presumably if the City of San Bruno's regional project moves forward, then a large portion of that would go to design of that budget earmark would help support that project. So also identified were these other opportunities for funding. The plan does represent a step up in what's needed in funding relative to what's currently there. So more funding would have to be identified. But the GI plan doesn't represent a commitment to a specific budget amount or a specific strategy at this point. But what does it represent a commitment to? So plan adoption today would represent a commitment to integrating green infrastructure into the city's planning and project delivery processes, which already happens, but the GI plan developed more tools to help facilitate that. It would represent a commitment to assessing feasibility of these prioritized projects and of also future capital projects, either green streets or parcel-based projects in the future for integration of GI, which is also a requirement of the permit and already happens annually, and to further evaluate long-term GI fundings to help bridge this gap. So the next steps would be, ideally, hopefully, the City Council adopts the GI plan. The city staff submit the GI plan next month as part of their annual report to the Water Board, and then to further evaluate these project concepts and funding sources, and then continue to participate in these CCAG initiatives such as Sustainable Streets Master Plan. That's it.
Okay. Jim, anything you'd like to add, or
I'm sorry?
anything you'd like to add?
No, I think Scott mentioned everything that we needed to mention.
Okay. To council, questions for Scott or for the director? Any? Laura.
Through the chair. So in the staff report, it indicates that there's a checklist. I mean, this is overwhelming for anybody coming in with a new development in terms of requirements. So there's some type of checklist that says, basically these are the things you're going to need to do. I mean, this is a great presentation, and there's a lot of really good information in there. Is there something in addition to just a checklist that we'll be giving to, because the thing we kind of hear back in the comments, oh, they didn't really know or they didn't really understand, is, how do we ensure that we're getting across what's needed? Because you can't really require it. You can suggest it, but right now we're not mandated, right? So that might change.
On private developments? Well, private developments that hit the threshold with 10,000 square feet of impervious area are mandated and do implement that. It's different in the streetscape, and that may change in the next permit. So the stormwater permit's being negotiated now, the third round of it, so that it will come out soon, and that may change requirements in the streetscape. But currently, it's only if you add a new lane that you're subject to it. So, but
okay.
Parcels that hit the 10,000 square foot threshold are subject to the C3 requirements, the permit requirements. The one thing that this plan and the Sustainable Streets Master Plan, which I mentioned, would like to further develop and are further developing are policy-based solutions to requiring developments to do improvements in the right-of-way, which isn't currently required. So if they had to do improvements on their own frontages, so that they would manage street runoff in addition to parcel runoff. So that's a policy that needs to be developed that doesn't exist. Some cities are working on that now. Redwood City just implemented it, but a number within the county want to do that, but it generally doesn't exist.
Okay. And so there are some requirements that are not, some items that are not required now. It says, so in the staff report it says, in the future it's likely the Regional Water Quality Control Board may start requiring agencies to implement improvements to the GI plans, right? So is there anything that we can anticipate and make sure it's included? I mean, now this is going to really happen. Or are we being too conservative, or are we really going to make sure that we're covering all of our boundaries? Because this is a big project, and you can tell that the team, fabulous job on staff of putting together a great team and putting this project together, and there's a lot of pieces to this. How do we, really get most of what we need to get done today versus having to come back and revisit this?
I think there are a number of the tools in there to help do that today. I think that, as I mentioned, that regional project, evaluating that feasibility is a big piece of this, because a number of cities within the county would like to have that opportunity to achieve their goals that way, because it's such a lower cost, relatively lower cost solution. So getting the grant to evaluate the funding of that is a big step. Developing the details, standard details that enable designers to know how we want it done, how we want it implemented, I think is a big step. So those are all part of this, which I think was really helpful.
And everything always comes down to funding, right? The funding's inadequate. So I guess does staff have ideas for, what we do going forward? And I guess we'll get to that at some point, but clearly the items listed for funding are just, not enough in terms of what's probably was needed.
And we totally understand about the funding and or the lack of that we have in the stormwater fund, right? So with that, the staff is continuing to look for opportunities to apply for grants, and we've submitted one grant, and we're still waiting to hear back. And we were able to coordinate, as Scott mentioned, through CCAG, and was recently awarded the $3 million, which we're planning to determine how. We're having a meeting with some of the agencies to try to determine how that money will be divided between some of the regional projects. So funding will be an issue down the road. I know not now, or, because some of these projects are not mandated, but eventually,
Right.
if the future MRPs, that comes through with more restrictions, there'll be more requirements for all the agencies, not just San Bruno, to be able to, comply with the MRP requirements, so that we can start. We're going to have to start constructing some of these, GI projects.
Yeah. And this is just an observation. Over the years, I've worked in other cities, working with some of our properties for the company I work with, and the amount of landscaping requirements have been, like, we just shake our head sometimes. Like, I can't believe something that's required on the back of a fence line that nobody sees, and nope, but they wanted the landscaping. And so it's all kind of making sense now, but I think it's good to see San Bruno putting the program together, and thank you for all the work that's been done.
Before I go to Marty, City Manager.
Yes. So I just wanted to piggyback off what Director Jimmy Tan said, which is at the end of the day, this will make a number of the projects that we do more expensive. And while the requirement now is to do and adopt the plan, we expect that there will be additional requirements for the infrastructure to be installed. And so as we redo our streetscapes, putting in the basins to ensure that more water goes into the ground is going to cost more. One of the things that we have started to look at is our stormwater fee to make sure that we are appropriately charging everyone. Right now, there is a $1,000 cap at the stormwater fee, and we're looking into that to making sure that all of the businesses are paying their fair share. And so we will continue to further that analysis. But absolutely, our stormwater fund is underfunded, and these requirements will add additional costs. And so, we should adopt this plan knowing that our projects will be a little bit more expensive, and how we obtain the funds to implement these projects is still a question mark. But we're doing the first step tonight, which is we've done the study and it's before council for approval.
Thank you. Thank
Marty?
you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for your report. This is another state mandated thing that cities have to deal with, and it's uncomfortable knowing our financial stability right now is a little rocky, but approving this is important. It's the first step. I'm looking in the staff report, and it mentions interim goals in 2020 and 2030. I'm interested in knowing what those goals are, and are we, we're right a year away. Are we going to be making that goal? And at some point, and definitely not tonight, I'm sure we'll hear back from staff about a timeline and how well are we tracking and achieving those goals. But I will be in support of this. It's something that we are required to do, and again, it's something that we're not going to have the money for, and that's by the state. And it's an unfortunate but important thing that we have to do.
Irene and then Michael.
All right.
Okay, they're going to switch. So Michael, then Irene.
Thank you. And just for the record, I'm Mike. So I thought this was a very good report, very comprehensive. It includes a lot of details and actually a lot more detail than I expected to see. It was a long report, and I tried to get through as much of it as possible. But some of it is even pretty technical. One of the things and it just dawned on me as I was listening to the speaker and talk about PCBs and mercury, and it's clearly important. I mean, beyond being a state mandate, I mean, keeping our environment clean is clearly, it should be one of our priorities, and regardless of the funding. And beyond just making the projects expensive, this is a maintenance thing that we're going to have to contend with going forward. And luckily, we're going to have a new facilities manager to help us manage that. But I was wondering, and this is a little bit out of context perhaps, but I'm wondering what's happening at the regional and state level to sort of take these pollutants out of the environment even before they get into our runoff. Has there been any significant progress in taking PCBs and mercury? And I was just now looking up, what are the typical sources of PCBs and mercury, and I know fossil fuels are going to contribute a lot to this. But is there anything that's being done to sort of clean that up? The PCBs are probably mostly coming from our PG&E transformers somehow. So is that industry being held accountable for the pollutants they're putting into the system? Are they looking at cleaner sources going forward? Are we going to get any relief beyond what we can do to sort of clean up their mess?
Yeah, there has been a number of studies of where the sources of PCBs and mercury are coming from throughout the Bay. That PCBs are largely legacy industries that aren't there anymore, but it's a man-made chemical that was involved in a lot of production industrial areas. So the sources of PCBs are still in a lot of the industrial areas throughout the Bay. So that part of the prioritization was identifying those potential areas and looking at doing improvements there. Mercury, as you mentioned, it's basically atmospheric at this point. It's fossil fuel production, and then it comes down, so it's everywhere. So it's hard to target unless you target the fossil fuels directly. But I think the state and the region are trying to address those and have addressed PCBs for sure. It's largely like legacy industries, but largely what you're talking about is source control. What we in stormwater call source control, which is preventing it from getting off a site in the first place and getting into stormwater. And the regional board is having conversations with the stormwater agencies around the Bay to how to make that better and how much that should be a part of this rather than green infrastructure. So I think that's what we're going to see moving forward is potentially more of a shift towards trying to do source control and less reliance a little bit on green infrastructure, or not making green infrastructure do that much of the heavy lifting, try to prevent it from getting into the runoff first. So that conversation is very much still happening with the regional board.
Okay, thank you.
Irene?
Thank you. I just want us to recognize that Kevin Mullen is the person who sponsored the grant money for the state, or from the state. He put in a request for $8 million. The CCAG organization asked him to for this kind of planning. Unfortunately, we only got 3, but we kind of figured we wouldn't get the whole 8. So that's where that came from. He sponsored that request. And I want people to know that the city of San Bruno started looking at this a long time ago. We started in 2008, I think, or 2009, that we actually applied to CCAG to get a grant to do a stormwater retention runoff area. If you go to Bel Air School and 3rd Avenue and you look west, you can see it. And I think it's in one of our planned, it's in the plan. So that also came through CCAG. And no, it was a start. We didn't continue because, again, funding is tight, but it's something that we as a city have looked at, and I know we'll continue to do it.
Okay, and I echo a lot of what my colleague said, so I won't repeat, but it's, again, another, as was indicated, another thing from the state that is being required on all jurisdictions, and of course, with that costs money. And so it was a very detailed report, and so I thank you, and obviously we have the goals that we must achieve, not hope to achieve. So with that, is there any other questions or comments from council? Any action from council? This is a resolution. Were there any speaker cards? Okay. So is there any other comments or questions from council? Any action from council? This is a resolution.
I move that we adopt the resolution.
Is there a second?
Second.
Councilmember Davis?
Aye.
Councilmember Medina?
Aye.
Councilmember Salazar?
Aye.
Vice Mayor O'Connell?
Aye.
Mayor Medina?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay.